Once we have this new logic in place from Frege, we're in a position to do several things. One thing we're in a position to do is to talk more about the semantics for language in general by talking about the semantics for this ideal language. How does language link up with important semantic notions like meaning and truth? That turns out to be central once you make the linguistic turn, because you're going to understand your metaphysical system in terms of the logical form of sentences in the language that you're talking about. So logical form is going to hold the key to lots of sorts of things. The first implication of it we've already seen in Moore, where Moore argued that mental state attributions have a different logical form than ordinary subject-predicate sentences have. And the fact that it has a different logical form shows that idealist arguments in favor of their metaphysical view are mistaken. It's not a matter of common sense, as Royce insisted. It's not a matter of pure dry logic that idealism is true. It's a matter of pure dry logic that idealism is subject to a confusion and refuted in some sense by the fact that the logical form of attributions of mentation to individuals has the form that it has. In any case, let's talk further about the other aspect of Frege's work, not just the new logic, but the semantics that's associated with it. We're going to come back to the logic and the logicism that Frege was proposing. He thought we could clean up mathematics by reducing it to logic. And it turns out there's a serious difficulty that has to be addressed, and it comes from the work of Russell. But we'll get to those two parts in this lecture. So first, here are two pictures of Friedrich Ludwig Gottlob Frege, standardly referred to as Gottlob Frege or just Frege. He's born in 1848, dies in 1925. The last paper we're going to look at by him, called Thought, appeared in 1919, so near the end of his life. His work was in the foundations of mathematics, and in particular, the central initial stage was 1879 to 1884. So he began his academic career at Jena in 1869, transferred in 1871, and gets a PhD in math in 1873. He begins lecturing at Jena, where he spent his entire career, in 1874, and publishes his first and maybe his most important work, the Begriffsschrift, in 1879. The Grundlagen, which is about the groundwork for the logic he's talking about, he publishes in 1884. The latter, the Grundlagen, is a non-technical philosophical justification of the ideas developed formally in the two-volume Grundgesetze, which was published in two volumes, first in 1893 and 1903. So you can think of the Grundlagen as a precursor to a more full-blown exposition that started in 1893, first published, and the second in 1903. The central thing to notice then is the 3 decades where the most serious work Frege ever did occur. The 1880s, where the Grundlagen was published, the 1890s, and the early 1900s. By the time we get past 1910, Frege is despondent, thinking that his project can't be completed. But we get still an expression of the underlying motivations for the view in the 1919 piece. Sadly, though, Frege died an unhappy person, thinking he had failed to rescue mathematics from the problems he saw for it. In addition to the books, Function and Concept, which we talked about last time, was published in 1891. You can see it as a precursor as well to the Grundgesetze. Second thing, most important thing that happened, is the famous Russell letter in 1902. June 16th of 1902. Now notice when that date falls. It falls after the first volume of the Grundgesetze appears and just before the second volume appears. That's important because that letter from Russell, if you don't know what I'm talking about, it is the letter that contains the set theory paradox that plagued Frege's early work. It was received while Frege was proofing the second volume of the Grundgesetze, and the letter claimed that he had a paradox for the set of all sets that are not members of themselves, a set that Frege's work implied existed. The offending axiom we will talk about, but it's axiom 5, standardly called the comprehension axiom. It claims that for every well-formed predicate, there exists a set of objects whose members are exactly those that satisfy the predicate in question. Recall from the last lecture the concept of saturation that Frege relies on. You saturate a predicate by putting an object into the empty places left in the predicate, and then you get either a true or a false, depending on whether the object in question satisfies the predicate. So the comprehension axiom says, if you've got a well-formed predicate, then there's a set theoretic interpretation of it in terms of all the objects that satisfy the predicate in question. We'll talk about the relationship here between this paradox and Cantor's diagonalization proof, because it's pretty clear that Russell had been reading Cantor, and Cantor has a diagonalization proof that was initially thought to be paradoxical. When it was first presented, mathematicians called it Cantor's paradox. Russell's paradox for Frege's work looks formally just like it. So we need to look at why Cantor's proof is actually a proof and not a paradox. His diagonalization argument, by the way, is a proof that the power set of a set can't be put in one-to-one correspondence with that set. And the way to say that is in terms of the language of cardinality. Cardinality is a cardinal number is 1, 2, 3, and 4, and ordinal number is first, second, third, fourth, fifth. So the cardinality, measure the size of a set in terms of its cardinality. If you take two sets and they can't be put in one-to-one correspondence with some other set, then the cardinality of one of them is larger than that of the other. Cantor was intrigued by the notion of infinity. So the power set of a set is the set of all the subsets of that set. And he said that power set will be strictly larger than the set that you started with in every case. That's interesting because that generates a hierarchy of larger and larger infinities. And Cantor, this work on the notion of the infinite, had theological ramifications for Cantor because he was theologically inclined. But it also got him into trouble, got people worrying about his mental state. And initially it wasn't well understood, the argument, but once it came to be seen that it was a good proof, you've got Cantor doing the same kind of thing as Russell, except Cantor's is a proof and Russell's is a paradox. So after 1891, Frege turns to semantics and the philosophy of language and publishes On Sense and Reference and Concept in Object, both in 1892. And by the time we get to the end of Frege's career, he publishes Thought in 1919. So we'll come back to the logic and logicism defended in Concept and Object. But first, let's talk a bit about On Sense and Reference. On Sense and Reference is Frege's attempt to show that you can get a general semantic theory from his distinctions between concept and object and sense and reference. You can get a general semantic theory that applies to all sorts of linguistic constructions, and the idea is, at least for an awful lot of natural language, we can use this apparatus to make sense of it. So the problem with which he begins is a problem of cognitive significance. Cognitive significance. So you start with some intuitive ideas that some sentences, the meaning of the sentence has to be slightly different than the meaning of some other sentence, or at least we have to account for the difference in some way or another, because a person can easily believe one of the sentences and not believe the other, endorse one of the sentences but not endorse the others. So the two sentences have to differ in cognitive significance in some way because they're just not the same. So the question is, how are we going to explain this? Now, Frege is a mathematician. So when he thinks about the problem of cognitive significance, he thinks about it in mathematical contexts. So he thinks about the problem of cognitive significance with respect to sentences like 2 equals 2, and other sentences like 1 plus 1 equals 2. In the first case, we have the same referring expression on both sides of the identity sign. In the other case, we don't. But both of them can be true. What that tells us is truth value by itself doesn't solve the problem of cognitive significance. That should have been obvious in the first place. Consider the sentence, Abraham Lincoln is president. It's false. Think of the sentence, Richard Nixon is president. It's also false. Nobody thinks those two sentences mean the same thing merely because they have the same truth value. Now, Frege goes beyond truth value here to what we can think of as the referent of a term. If you have a name, what is the semantic function of a name? It is to pick out an object. So if I say Richard Nixon is president, there's a name, Richard Nixon. What is its semantic role? It refers to a particular object, in this case, one who's already died. But in any case, this referential theory of at least important parts of language is a very natural place to start when you're trying to understand how language works. Here's how language works. You begin with the idea that words pick out things. That works extremely well for names, at least at first pass. You have a name. I have a name. What is the semantic function of those names? Well, to pick out or refer to the object in question. And then there's a predicate that follows. And what we look for is whether the object that's picked out actually satisfies the predicate. So take the predicate is at least 7 feet tall. There are some objects that satisfy that predicate. I happen not to be one of them, and I bet none of you are either. So in each case, when you put our name in a sentence together with that predicate, you look for the set of things that is at least 7 feet tall, and you ask yourself whether the object that each of our names picks out is one of the objects that is in the set attached to the predicate is at least 7 feet tall. In that case, if it is, then you'll say the object satisfies the predicate. I would say the object has the property in question. But in any case, whatever it is, the fundamental role of names is to pick out objects. That's a good place to start, and it would be fairly straightforward and simple if all of language could be accounted for in terms of reference. But Frege notices immediately that it doesn't even work where it's most at home in our understanding of language, because A equals A, where A and B are names, A equals A is something that you can believe, even though you don't believe A equals B, even when A and B are co-referential, even when they pick out the same thing. There are many examples of this. Frege wants to use two referring expressions as his primary example, the morning star and the evening star. One of the most important discoveries in ancient astronomy is that the morning star and the evening star are in fact the same object. They pick out the same object. And it turns out not to be a star, but a planet. It's Venus. So he's going to talk a lot about the morning star and the evening star. I think that probably wasn't the most helpful place to start, because these are not names. These are definite descriptions. So Venus is a name, and it's an interesting question that we're going to talk about some. What's the relationship between names and corresponding definite descriptions, even if the definite description is a correct one? Names are things like Joe, Billy, maybe Billy Bob, as in Thornton, that sort of thing. You can generate this puzzle actually using names rather than the definite descriptions that Frege uses. For example, Cicero and Tully are two different names for the same individual. Sam Clemens and Mark Twain, two names for the same individual. And so you could know something about Mark Twain, but be suspicious about the same thing when it's attached to Sam Clemens, because maybe you don't realize Mark Twain and Sam Clemens are the same individual. This even works for fictional characters. Superman and Clark Kent, same individual. So the problem is that the cognitive significance of a statement of equality can vary. Nobody sane, in full command of their faculties, doubts that A equals A. That's why when Bishop Butler says everything is what it is and not another thing, nobody objects to that claim. Identity is a unique relation which, in the first instance, holds between a thing and itself. That's not actually worth spending a lot of time defending. What's more interesting is, are there cases where it's not an example of A equals A, where the identity claim is nonetheless true? And the answer is yes. Sam Clemens is identical to Mark Twain. But the cognitive significance of that sentence is much different than the cognitive significance of the trivial claim that Mark Twain is Mark Twain, or the claim that Sam Clemens is Sam Clemens. So what are we going to do? Well, Frege first talked about this in the Begriffsschrift. And there he said, identity is a relation between names or signs, not a relation between things. So what you're really saying is, when somebody writes A equals A, they're actually not being careful. They should have said, the name A is identical to the name A. They should have put it in single quotes. We're going to see this issue about logical, what's the right word? Carelessness appear over and over and over in this course, where somebody confuses, in this case, a crate contains a rat. Now, if that's true, that's a crate that I'd like to stay away from. But notice what this sentence says gets changed dramatically. When I write the sentence the way I just wrote it, you're thinking about boxes usually constructed out of wood and a certain animal that likes to live in sewers. But if I put single quotes around crate and rat, now I'm saying something completely different and something that's obviously true. This word contains that word. That's the difference between using a word and mentioning the word. So what Frege claims in the Begriffsschrift is, when you say A equals A, you're not actually using the term A, you're mentioning it. So you should have put single quotes about it. Now, what he didn't recognize, apparently, is that this refutes the starting point with which he began immediately. Because if it's a relation between signs, then A equals B should be represented this way. A equals the sign A, the name A is the same as the name B. But that's obviously false because this is A and that's B. So it turns out there couldn't be on this proposal any statements of equality that are not statements of self-identity. There's something I want to show you that we're going to talk about. This is Jeff Speak's notes. Jeff teaches at Notre Dame, and he talks about this. And here's something that he says about the Begriffsschrift view. So he's talking about the Begriffsschrift view, where equality is a relation between names, not contents. So here's the quote from the Begriffsschrift. Equality of content differs from conditionality and negation by relating to names, not to contents. Contents would be the thing picked out by the name. Elsewhere, signs are mere proxies for their content. That's the statement that signs or names refer to things. So they stand for things, but not in this case. Jeff says this, and I think he's exactly right about this. This idea that identity is a relation between names rather than things is bizarre in the context of Frege's theory of reference. Names for Frege contribute the object for which they stand to the truth condition of sentences in which they occur. Why should they, in this one case, stand not for an object, but for themselves? That strikes me as exactly the right thing to think. What I add to that is, if we follow Frege on this point, there is no problem of cognitive significance for statements of equality, because no statement of equality will be true unless the identity symbol is flanked by the same term or sign. So A equals B will never be an accurate, correct statement of equality. Frege agrees that the Begriffsschrift view is inadequate, not for the reasons that Jeff mentions, not for the argument, not on the basis of the argument that I just gave you, but here's what he says. We need to distinguish between that which is presented through the use of a name and the mode of presentation. Thus, for example, the same thing is presented in one mode as the morning star. What mode is that? Well, it's a mode that you get when you get up early enough and the last star you see on the horizon as the sun's coming up is this star, which is not a star but a planet. And another quite different mode as the evening star. So go outside when the sun is setting and look for the first star that's visible in the sky. That's the evening star, and it too is Venus. Nonetheless, what is presented is the same in each case. So notice what he's doing. He's saying, when you have a statement of equality with different terms flanking, what's wrong with the Begriffsschrift view is it fails to distinguish the object referred to, what is presented, with the mode of presentation. So instead of the difference between a term referring to itself and it referring to an object, we now have two different semantic notions. We have a case where reference can be characterized, and yet something semantic is different, the mode of presentation. Let's call that the difference between the sense of a term and the reference of a term. So that's where he wants to go to improve on the Begriffsschrift view, a view that clearly needed improving on. So the notion of reference is that which is presented, the object pointed to or indicated by the term in question. The sense is that which contains the mode of presentation. Now that's metaphorical. This notion of containment is something that applies to physical things. Senses aren't physical things, so you might still be a little bit confused. I say at this point, why don't we just identify modes of presentation with senses and see where that takes us? After drawing this distinction, Frege then addresses some complications. Now, the point of addressing these complications is to show that you might think this distinction between sense and reference can't be applied generally enough to give us a complete theory of language. Much of on sense and reference is a detailed analysis of all sorts of unusual contexts or things that might cause you to worry. We're going to need more than the distinction between sense and reference to get a complete understanding of language. A lot of that is laborious to go through, but that's what Frege is up to. So he says, for example, what are we going to do with quotes? Well, that we're going to introduce a further distinction between indirect reference and sense. Sense can vary from speaker to speaker in natural languages, though in an ideal language it shouldn't. So there's some complications. Quotation presents one. Sense, it looks like he's thinking, can vary from one speaker to another if you're speaking in a natural language, but not if we're in a perfect ideal language. What does he have in mind here? Well, think about what modes of presentation were for the Morning Star and the Evening Star. It's your way of psychologically accessing the object that is referred to by the phrase or name in question. Now let's run with that. Maybe there's a way to avoid that given characterization of it, but let's go with that one for now. Here's a question for you. Who is Hezekiah? Who do you think of and how do you think of them when you think of Hezekiah? Maybe you don't think about anything at all. I am hard-pressed to come up with a definite description of any sort that picks out Hezekiah. But in any case, whatever one I pick out, it might not be the same one as the one you pick out. Here's another example, North Dakota. How do you access the object referred to by that term? I grew up in North Dakota, so I expect that the images I associate with North Dakota and the descriptions I'd give of it, they might overlap some with the images and descriptions that you give of it, but they don't need to. So those can differ in natural languages. Frege says that's no problem because we are going to idealize. We're talking about an ideal language. It's an interesting question whether that move solves this problem or not. I mean, let's move to an ideal language. We're still going to have different origins and the like, no matter how ideal the language is. So it's not really clear how the images and associations of a term like North Dakota are going to disappear just because our language is now ideal. But let's let that one go. Frege is also worried about natural languages in another way. Natural sense in natural languages is normally only sense in a context, but in an ideal language, each different sense would be expressible by a unique term. So here you can see what he's doing. First, quotation is a serious issue to be dealt with. And the second two, he's just, there's a bit of hand waving going on here that remember to impose the distinction between natural and ideal languages when you're thinking about how to assess my semantic theory that relies simply on these two notions, the notion of sense and the notion of reference. Then he resorts to some clarifications. Don't think of either sense or reference in terms of ideas. The referent is wholly objective, the idea is purely something in your head, and the sense is somewhere in between those two. But this is metaphorical and vague. When we get to thought, the last paper we're looking at, the one published in 1919, we'll see a more metaphysical characterization of these three realms. So the realm of the senses is going to be the third realm. There's the objective realm. That's the realm of objects. That's why it's called objective. Then there's the purely subjective realm, the realm of ideas. But there has to be a third realm, something in between the two. And Frege here uses the language of looking at a planet through a telescope. The image in the telescope is somehow intermediate between the subjective awareness you're experiencing and the object itself, the planet, which is objective. How should we use this language of sense and reference? Here are the two fundamental locutions. A linguistic device designates its referent. A linguistic device expresses its sense. So, the term Sam Clements designates Mark Twain, but it doesn't express Mark Twain because Mark Twain is the object in question. What are the metaphysical implications of this view? For words or expressions, the referent in question is an object, and the sense is not an object. It's something like the meaning of the term or phrase, perhaps a concept, but definitely not an object. To say that Frege's sense-reference distinction implies that some of the objects in the universe are senses is simply a mistake. When you do your ontology, you make a list of all the objects that exist. None of them will be senses. So that's what we do for parts of sentences. Does this help us for sentences on the whole? Frege thinks the answer is yes. So he's going to claim this distinction between sense and reference will help us understand the thought, which is the whole sentence. We might call it now the proposition, the meaning of the sentence, perhaps, because it's not the subjective thinking, but that which is common between thinkers who are thinking the same. That sounds like the meaning of a sentence, the propositional content of a sentence, something like that. So thoughts are going to be senses with respect to complete sentences. Moreover, sentences have a referent. This is a bit strange sounding. The two truth values are the true and the false, and so the sentence, snow is white, refers to the true. The sentence, the sky is green, refers to the false. That's a seemingly awkward way of speaking, except perhaps it's not as bad as it sounded, because these phrases, the true and the false, are shorthand for the circumstances that a certain sentence is true. So when I say snow is white, refers to the true, what that means is that snow is white, that sentence refers to the circumstances that the sentence, the snow is white, is true. The fully expanded one may not be as strange sounding as the short description is. So a declarative sentence is a proper name, so that if it has a referent, it is either the true or the false. And Frege gives an argument for it. But before we look at the argument, notice what we just said. If it has a referent. So notice here, Frege is rejecting bivalence. Bivalence is the view that if you've got a declarative sentence that's well formed, it is either true or false and not both. There are only two truth values and there are no gaps. That's bivalence. Frege endorses gaps. It might be a declarative sentence that has no referent at all. That would make it fit with other aspects of ordinary language because there are empty names in ordinary language. Maybe fictional names are empty names because they don't actually refer to anything. But even for things like phlogiston that play an important role in the history of science, there's no guarantee that there is that sort of thing in the world just because we have a term for it. So maybe declarative sentences, there ought to be truth value gaps or something like that. But in any case, Frege gives the following argument for the claim that if a sentence has a referent, it must be either the true or the false. Every sentence has a sense. That's supposed to be obvious because a sentence just is something that expresses a proposition or thought. So there's two possibilities. Either sentences have senses but no reference, or they have both. Sometimes we inquire after the referent of the parts of a sentence. Yes, we do. If you use a name that I've never heard of before and say something about that individual, I will inquire about the referent of the name. But the sense of a sentence is the same whether the parts have reference or not. Right? The sense of the sentence doesn't depend on the reference, whether they have reference or not. Therefore, a sentence must have something in addition to a sense to explain what it is that we're looking for, when after understanding a sentence, we inquire as to whether the parts have a reference and whether the referent in question is properly described by the predicate. What are we looking for? Well, obviously, we're looking for the truth value. We want to know if the sentence is true. So you can understand a sentence, but not have a clue as to whether it's true or false. So there's something else to be looked for. What are you looking for? A truth value. So the truth value is just the reference of a sentence. As I understand this argument, I think here's the best way to characterize what's going on. If you have a semantic theory with only two crucial elements in it, sense and reference, and you're trying to explain everything in terms of them, you're going to have to make the truth value the referent of a declarative sentence. You can't make the sense of it play this role, because you've already established that it's an understood sentence, so the sense is grasped, and you're still looking for something else, and that's going to have to be the referent, because that's the only resources your theory has. What this can't be is an argument for the conclusion that it claims to be an argument for, because the argument here clearly presupposes that we've got nothing else to talk about other than sense or reference. And once you limit yourself to those two items, then of course, if you're going to explain what it is that we're looking for when we're looking for something else after we've already understood a sentence, you've already established the role that the sense of the sentence is playing, so all you've got left to appeal to is reference. That's all your theory involves. So you can think of it that way. If we're limited to sense and reference, then we have to posit truth values as the referent of sentences. Notice here then that the true and the false are objects, not concepts. So that's important because think about it. There's a couple of different ways to think about the relationship between truth and propositions. So take a proposition such as snow is white. Let's use that one. There are two different ways that we standardly use the language of truth and falsity to characterize this sentence. One is we can turn it into a predicate, the language of truth and falsity, and we can say the sentence, snow is white, is true. That's to attribute a property to the sentence in question. A second use is, let's just say S is W for snow is white, is to use the language of truth as an operator on this proposition, where we say, it is true that snow is white. Both of those are perfectly well-formed, coherent, logical interpretations of the way in which the language of truth and falsity attaches to sentences or propositions. Notice the first one where where the language of truth and falsity is treated as a predicate. It's a predicate of sentences. I suppose you could also make it a predicate of propositions. But in any case, it is true that is clearly an operator, and it's an operator on a proposition. Frege says neither one of those is the right way to think about it. All you have are objects and concepts. This talk about operators is not yet part of Frege's conceptual apparatus for understanding how language works. All you've got are objects and concepts. The language of truth and falsity is not a concept. Instead, it has to be an object because nothing can be the referent of anything unless it's an object. That's the first part of the theory. The second part of the article is testing the theory in all sorts of complicated cases that may lead you to worry that a semantic theory appealing to sense and reference alone can't be up to the task of explaining these other things. And Frege's task is to show how to use this theory to do the work that he thinks needs to be done in these other cases. So I'll leave that to you to look at the notes and work through that. What I want to focus on instead is a more thematic approach about what's going on in sense and reference so that we get a better big picture view of what's going on. So start with a general approach to language and say, here's where I start. I noticed that there's lots of words. In fact, if you think about how are you going to teach, so you have a little baby. Little babies can't do much, and especially they can't talk much, so you want to teach them how to talk. You want to teach them your language. In my case, that's English. So I want to teach my kids this language. So they start growing up. How do I do this? Well, I point to objects and tell them their name. So I point to my wife and I say, Mama. I point to her older brother and I say, Jared. So I start using referring expressions. It's the most obvious thing in the world to do. You go in your backyard. Now, this gets a little more complicated because these aren't names, but just go with the general idea that what I'm doing is exploiting reference. So I go in the front yard because neighbor's walking his dog. So I want my children to learn dogs, cats, horses, cows, all these sorts of terms. So I point to the animal being led down the street and I say dog. In some sense or other, what I'm doing is exploiting a notion of reference to try to get the child to understand what the noise coming out of my mouth means. We attach semantic significance to noises coming out of our mouths on the basis of some notion of reference. And we point at the same time. So you point at an object, you say tree. You point at a flower and say rose. You're doing this all over the place. So what's obvious is central to our understanding of language is some notion of reference. We also have a desire for a simple understanding of language, so the thought should occur to you, what else do we need? Why can't we just get by with the notion of reference alone? Why isn't that enough? Frege gives us 3 arguments on sense and reference, why we can't get by with the notion of reference alone, that there must be more to semantic meaning than reference. The one we've been focusing on is Frege's puzzle about identity sentences. But that's not the only one. Here's another one that Frege focuses on. The argument regarding understanding and our knowledge of reference. It seems plausible that one understands an expression if and only if you know what it means. If this is right, then we have a new form in which we can raise our question about whether the theory of reference can serve as a full theory of language. We can ask whether to understand an expression, one must know its referent, its reference. Frege says no. The sense of a proper name is grasped by everyone who knows the language or the totality of designations of which the proper name is a part. This, however, illuminates the reference, if there is any, in a very one-sided fashion. A complete knowledge of the reference would require that we could tell immediately in the case of any given sense whether it belongs to the reference. This we shall never be able to do. Here, Frege claims that we lack the kind of knowledge of reference that we have of the meaning of an expression. If anything is obvious, that should be obvious. So you can understand an expression long before you can figure out what it's referring to. Just from understanding an expression, we are typically not in a position to know what its reference is. Now, maybe that's too strong. Maybe for many expressions, maybe even for most, understanding an expression puts you in a position to know what its reference is, but it doesn't have to. That's the central argument here. So here's how we should understand this kind of an argument. To understand an expression is to know its meaning, so it's necessary that if two expressions have the same meaning, then anyone who understands both will know that they have the same meaning. But it's possible to understand two expressions without knowing that they have the same reference, so reference can't be the same thing as meaning. That means we need to introduce something else, the sense of expressions and sentences. So it's not just that a sense explains differences in cognitive value, it is also what speakers who understand the relevant expression know. Okay, that's a second argument. Here's a third one. This one is about opaque contexts. A theory of reference is supposed to explain the links between language and the world by assigning to expressions what those expressions contribute to the truth or falsity of sentences in which they occur. We've just argued that such a theory can't also explain the links between languages and their users, whether this is cashed out in terms of cognitive significance or knowledge of meaning. But there are sentences which seem to show that a theory of reference can't, by itself, even explain the connections between sentences and the world. Chief among these are sentences about mental states, called propositional attitude descriptions, and about necessity and possibility. Consider the following pairs of sentences. Bob believes that the greatest student of Plato was a philosopher. Who's the greatest student of Plato? Bob believes that the greatest teacher of Alexander the Great was a philosopher. Now, it turns out the greatest student of Plato is also the greatest teacher of Alex the Great, Aristotle. But notice one of those sentences could be true and the other false. Bob believes that 2 plus 2 equals 4. Bob believes that 2 plus 2 equals the positive cube root of 64. Notice once again, one of those sentences could be true and the other one false. Necessarily, all chordates are chordates. Necessarily, all chordates are renates. In each of these cases, the sentences differ only in substitution of expressions which have the same reference, and yet seem to differ in truth value. Or at least they could differ in truth value. The one where they do differ in truth value might be the third one. But in any case, the three could come apart. It's possible that Bob's very special. He believes both of these things, but he doesn't need to be. It's possible that Bob knows that the greatest student of Plato is the greatest teacher of Alexander the Great, but he could believe one of those sentences and not the other by being ignorant of that fact. So in each case, they could differ in truth value. The places in the sentence where this can happen, where substitution of co-referential expressions can change truth value, are called opaque contexts, sometimes non-extensional contexts, more generally intentional contexts. So if you've got a case where X occurs as part of a sentence, and it turns out x is equal to y, there are some sentences where you can substitute y for x and not affect the truth value at all. It simply wouldn't happen, couldn't happen. Truth value would have to be the same. So, for example, let 4 be x, let the positive cube root of 64 be y. Then if we substitute y for x in 2 plus 2 equals 4, there's no possibility that we ended up with a sentence that was false when we started out with a sentence that's true. Call that a transparent or non-opaque context, call it an extensional context, whatever you want, like that. There are other cases, though, where when you substitute co-referring expressions, the truth value can change. Those are called intensional contexts with an S, because the other contexts were extensional contexts with an S. So intensional here just means non-extensional. Or, as Quine, I think, is the originator of this language, called them, opaque contexts. You can't substitute identicals for identicals in these contexts and be guaranteed to preserve truth value. Those include modal contexts. So how many planets are there? Used to be 9. I think technically now we're supposed to say 8 equals the number of planets. So you can have necessarily 8 equals 8. Nobody should question that one. But necessarily 8 equals the number of the planets, that's not true. It's not a necessary truth that the number of planets is 8. It's a scientific truth, perhaps, but it's not a necessary truth. So modal contexts are opaque. Those are the kinds of contexts in using the language of necessity and possibility and substituting equivalence in those contexts doesn't preserve truth value always. Other intensional contexts are generalizations on modal contexts. So when you look at intensional logics, they start with modal logic, the logic concerning necessity and possibility, but they also include temporal logics, epistemic logics, deontic logics, those sorts of things. And each of those are intensional logics as well. As a result, you can't count on preservation of truth value by substituting identicals in these contexts. Notice mental state attributions are also examples of that. No matter how obvious an identity statement is to people, it can be easily disbelieved by some people, so long as it's not a self-identity claim of the form A equals A. Okay, so those are the 3 arguments for a distinction between sense and reference that we find in this paper. What are the theoretical roles of senses? So think of it this way. You've started out, can I get by with just reference? No, I can't. I have to have senses. Okay, so you've got this thing and you want to know, what is it going to do? What does it have to do in my theory? That's the theoretical role that you have to posit for this new thing that you claim is going to have to be needed in any adequate theory. First, it would really be nice if you could tell us when we have 2 distinct senses rather than just one. The first and second arguments show that sense must explain cognitive significance, and this suggests that the senses should be individuated as follows. 2 sentences differ in cognitive significance if and only if it's possible for a rational agent to understand both and to take one to be true while doubting that the other is. For suppose senses didn't obey this criterion, then it would be possible for a rational subject to consider two sentences with the same sense and hold one to be true and the other false. But then the same arguments used to show the cognitive significance must be explained in terms of something other than reference could also be used to show that it must be explained in terms of something other than sense. And we could also use such a case to argue that it is possible to understand a sentence without knowing its sense, using the premise that if understanding is knowledge of sense, then anyone who understands a pair of sentences with the same sense will be in a position to know that they have the same sense. Okay, so first we have a way of individuating senses that results from the kinds of arguments used for generating the requirement that there be, in addition to reference, the sense of a term or sentence. Second, sense determines reference, but not the reverse. According to Frege, sense determines reference. Any two expressions with the same sense or meaning will also have the same reference. Why would you think that? Well, one reason intuitively is that if two sentences have the same sense, they say the same thing about the world. And if two sentences say the same thing about the world, they can't differ in truth value. Because truth value is generated by what the world is like. But if the reference of a sentence is its truth value, that means that the sense of a sentence determines its reference. Reference doesn't determine sense, however. Often two expressions with the same reference will differ with respect to sense. That's the original identity puzzle that Frege was talking about. Third, indirect reference. Sense is supposed to do something in cases that Frege talks about in terms of indirect reference. So far, what we said doesn't say anything about what we should say about opaque contexts. Frege made the following suggestion about the semantics of these attitude descriptions. When words are used in the customary manner, then what is talked about is their reference. But it may happen that one wants to talk about the words themselves or about their senses. The first occurs when one quotes someone else's words in direct ordinary discourse. In writing, we make use of quotes enclosing the word icons. In indirect discourse, we speak of the sense, the words of someone else. From this, it becomes clear that also in indirect discourse, words do not have their customary reference. They here name what would ordinarily be their sense. Notice what Frege is doing here. He's saying, I have a theory of language. I have a theory of language which began with symbols, or what he calls signs. And then I have this device, the phenomenon of reference, to which I've said we have to add the phenomenon of sense. So we have three items in our language. And now we need to be able to talk about contexts where words are used, but not to talk about the things in the world that is the referent of those words or phrases or sentences. That is, it may happen that one wants to talk about the words themselves or about their senses. So what he's proposing here is, I don't need to supplement this theory of language to talk about these other kinds of things, cases of both direct and indirect quotation. If we're talking about direct quotation, if I say, Joe said snow is white, I can just put single quotes around the sentence in question. That's direct quotation. I'm talking about this doesn't have its ordinary meaning or reference, so it doesn't refer to the true or the false. Since I put it in single quotes, I'm referring to this sentence itself. That's how we handle direct quotation. Indirect quotation happens when, the clearest cases is, suppose Joe says, this. I am tired. Now, I can tell you what Joe said in two different ways. I can say, hey, Joe said, I am tired. And then you have to put single quotes around the sentence, I am tired, in order to get the logical form of what I just said correct. But I can also report indirectly. Joe said, hey, Joe said that he's tired. Now there, Joe didn't utter the sentence, he is tired. But Joe did say that he's tired. That's indirect quotation. So how does Frege propose to handle indirect quotation? That's what's going on in the second part here. In indirect discourse, we speak of the sense. So when I say Joe said he's tired, what is the referent of the sentence he's tired? It's not a truth value. It's not the true or the false. It is the sense of the sentence, he is tired. That's what Frege is proposing his theory allows him to do. It's the sense of the words of someone else. It is the sense of these words, I am tired. So sometimes words don't have their customary reference, but that's not any reason to reject the overall structure of my semantic theory. There's something I want you to note about this because this is going to come up again later on. So the sense of this sentence in the mouth of Joe has to be the same as the sense of this sentence in my mouth. So when Joe utters, I am tired, there is a sense expressed by his sentence. And when I say Joe said he's tired, the referent of he's tired has to be that very same sense. So that means the sense of Joe's utterance, I am tired, has to be accessible to me, since it is the referent, since it is a sense which is the referent of that sentence in my mouth. We'll come back to that later. It turns out to be a difficult view to sustain. Next, what are the bearers of truth and falsity? As we'll see in the thought, Frege points out that we call lots of things true or false, pictures, sentences, sounds, but we call these things true or false only insofar as they express something, and this something that they express is their sense. Thoughts, the senses of sentences, are the primary bearers of truth and falsity, and the other things which we call true or false are only insofar as the relevant thought is true or false. So we should distinguish Frege's positive view about sense from his arguments that there is a certain set of roles which something or other must fill, namely these four: being what is expressed by sentences, being the referent of that clauses, and being the primary bearer of truth and falsity. Moreover, a prima facie plausible case can be made that the same entity can and should play each of these roles. Okay, so that's the theoretical role, but when you describe the theoretical role of a thing, you don't yet have a complete grip on what these things are. So what are these things? In the thought, Frege says they can't be mental. That's the first thing. And he's already said that in On Sense and Reference. Don't identify modes of presentation with ideas. So they can't be mental items. In the thought, he puts it this way: if every thought requires an owner and belongs to the contents of his consciousness, then the thought has this owner alone. There's no science common to many on which many could work, but perhaps I have my science, a totality of thoughts whose owner I am and another person has his. Each of us is concerned with the content of his own consciousness. No contradiction between the two sciences would then be possible, and it would be really idle to dispute about truth, as idle, indeed, almost as ludicrous as for two people to dispute whether a 100-mark note were genuine, where each meant the one he had in his pocket and understood the word genuine in his own particular sense. If someone takes thoughts to be ideas, what he then accepts as true is, on his own view, the content of his consciousness, and does not properly concern other people at all. If he heard from me the opinion that a thought is not an idea, he could not dispute it, for indeed it would now not concern him. Well, this is laborious, but whatever they are, it's obvious Frege thinks senses must be available to more than one thinker, on pain of loss of lots of things. Maybe every thought is true because it's yours. Maybe communication's impossible because you can't ever share your thoughts with me. And anyway, there are some pretty convincing arguments that thoughts can't be mental images. Mental images aren't available for enough kinds of linguistic expressions. Think of these: chiliagon, sake, such, behest. There are no mental images that you associate with those unless it's the word itself, and that's, of course, a mistaken path to go down. Widespread variance in images associated with different individuals. Remember my North Dakota example. What images do you associate with North Dakota? I'm pretty sure they're not the same ones that I associate with it. If that's true, then no one would ever mean the same thing by a word as anyone else, or at least it would be very rare for that to occur. An argument parallel to Frege's seems to show that senses can't be linguistic items either, since the same thoughts are often available to speakers of different languages. Now we saw in On Sense and Reference, Frege's analogy. It's the analogy of observing the moon through a telescope. But notice this is just an analogy. Frege makes more straightforward claims about the metaphysical category to which sense belongs near the end of the paper Thought. Here's what he says. So the result seems to be thoughts are neither things in the external world nor ideas. A third realm must be recognized. Anything belonging to this realm has it in common with ideas that it can't be perceived by the senses, but has it in common with things that it does not need an owner so as to belong to the contents of consciousness. Thus, for example, the thought we have expressed in the Pythagorean theorem is timelessly true, true independently of whether anyone takes it to be true. He could have also said true independently of whether anyone ever thinks or has thought about the Pythagorean theorem. It needs no owner. It is true only from the time when it is not true only from the time when it was discovered, just as a planet, even before anyone saw it, was in interaction with other planets. It seems that for Frege, senses are a sui generis concept of abstracta, which are, in some sense, modes of presentation of, among other things, objects. We should perhaps be a bit suspicious about positing a category of entities whose sole role is to serve as the contents of linguistic expressions and the objects of thought. That is worth emphasizing. Russell once said, "The job of philosophy," I'm paraphrasing, "is to take things so simple and obvious and easy to understand and show that in order to understand them properly, you have to endorse some things that are so wild and implausible that no one would ever believe them." There's a sense in which you can take that description and attach it to Frege's theory. Frege said, we do understand language. Nothing could be more obvious and simple. Then he asks us to consider what we would need to posit in order to account for how we understand language. And now, all of a sudden, there's this entirely new realm of reality, the third realm that we have to posit. Compare this view with a view that Russell's going to argue against, that of Meinong. Meinong says Reference is absolutely central in understanding reality and what's true and what's false, what exists and what has being. Since reference plays such a crucial role, we should understand the meaning of a sentence and its connection with truth value when it includes a definite description in terms of the notion of reference. So if we want to talk about the present Queen of England being rather old, we first have to run out and find a referent for the phrase, the present Queen of England. So we do that, and then we check to see whether the predicate applies. That's how we determine the truth or falsity of a sentence. You go out and you find the object in question, and you see if the predicate applies to it or not. So now take, Ponce de Leon was looking for the fountain of youth. This turns out to be false. He wasn't. One of his enemies said he was so stupid he was out there doing that, and the story apparently caught on. So it gets portrayed. In fact, I was told it was true when I was in school. I don't know what you were taught. But in any case, it's a myth. He wasn't out looking for the fountain of youth. He may be stupid, but he wasn't that stupid. In any case, how do you determine whether this is true or not? Well, Meinong said, you got to go find the thing referred to by the phrase, the fountain of youth, and then you check to see whether it's the sort of thing, it's the thing that Ponce de Leon was looking for. And now you should say, wait, that can't be right. There is no fountain of youth. Meinong will smile and say, ah, you're mistaken. Reality has two parts to it, existence and subsistence. For the things that you classify as not being real, I classify as having a reality of a different sort. Let's say, I'm not sure if this is his terminology, but let's say the fountain of youth doesn't exist, it merely subsists. And we say the same thing for other definite descriptions that don't seem to pick out anything that actually exists. The present King of France, the Golden Mountain, the Fountain of Youth, all those sorts of things. They look like they don't have a referent, but according to Meinong, they have to have a referent because we can't explain why the sentences in question are false unless we complicate our ontology in this way. It looks like this is just something similar to what Frege is doing. Frege is saying we have words. Words stand for things, so we have reference. The things stood for are objective, so we have both words and we have ideas in the head, and we've also got objective things that aren't dependent on ideas in the head at all. So we have both the objective realm and the subjective realm. And so far, everything looks pretty clean. But then he says, that's not enough. We need a third realm. That should make you worry about Frege's view a little bit. Is it possible to get by with something else? In any case, let's take a look at some of the objections that can be launched against Frege's theory. The first one comes from concept and object. Frege feels the need to respond to this objection first raised by Benno Carey. And Benno Carey, I think we know hardly anything about except as the author of this objection. Carey's objection is the distinction, there is a distinction between concept and object, but it is not the kind of distinction that Frege needs it to be. Frege needs it to be an exclusive distinction. Nothing is both a concept and an object. Carey says that's a mistake. In a previous passage, I have myself expressed the opinion that the relation between the content of a concept and the concept object is, in a certain respect, a peculiar and irreducible one. But this was in no way bound up with the view that the properties of being a concept and of being an object are mutually exclusive. That's the crucial thing. Are these mutually exclusive categories? Carey says there's clearly a difference, but exclusivity isn't the right way to think about that. The latter view follows no more from the former then it would follow if, e.g., the relation of father and son were one that could not be further reduced, that a man could not be at once a father and a son. Though, of course, he says, you can't be the father of the man whose son he was. Okay, so Carey's objection is this distinction between concept and object is not exclusive. But Frege insisted that it was. And Carey's example is this sentence. The concept horse is a concept easily attained. So don't read the rest of the quote yet. I won't read the rest of the quote. Just look at the sentence. How does Frege propose to understand this sentence? Well, you divide the subject and the predicate. The subject is a definite description. If it has a referent, it will have as its referent an object. So forget about the predicate, whether the predicate actually attaches to this concept. The predicate says that whatever this thing picks out is a concept. So don't worry about whether the concept is easily attained or not. Just boil this down to its bare bones. Is the concept horse a concept? That's the objection. And it looks like, dang, if it's not a concept, we're in big trouble. So, now let's read Frege's response. He gives the following example. The concept horse is a concept and thinks that the concept horse is an object. And thinks that the concept horse is an object, in fact, one of the objects that falls under the concept easily attained, or as I've simplified it, under the concept. Quite so, the three words, the concept horse, do denote an object. Okay, slow down right there. The three words, the concept horse, do designate an object. But on that very account, they do not designate a concept. Start over. I'm worried that I said that backwards. The three words, the concept horse, do not designate an object. I'm sorry. The three words, the concept horse, do designate an object. Why? Because that's how reference works. Definite descriptions denote objects if they denote anything at all. So they designate an object. The three words designates an object. But on that very account, they don't designate a concept, as I am using the word. That you should see as subterfuge. Just his theory requires that they not be a concept. It's not a matter of him adopting an unusual, strange meaning for the term. He can't stipulate what the word means. What he can do is propose a theory. And as his theory is proposed, they can't designate a concept. Now he's going to defend this way of doing things. This is in full accord with the criterion I gave, that the singular definite article always indicates an object, whereas the indefinite article accompanies a concept word. Okay, so right, that's not a defense, that's just noting the aspect of his proposal that requires him to say what he just said. Carey calls my criterion unsuitable, for surely, he says in the sentence, the concept that I'm now talking about is an individual concept. The name composed of the first 8 words stands for a concept. But he's not taking the word concept in my sense, and it is not what I have laid down that the contradiction lies. But nobody can require that my mode of expression shall agree with Carey's. Now, you should smile at the defensiveness of this remark, and you should lament its goofiness. Goofy is not a technical philosophical objection to a view, but it's the word I'm going to use here. This is utterly goofy. What he can do is propose a theory, but what he can't do is stipulate a use of the word so that his theory comes out true. That's what these last remarks have to do if they're going to count as a decent response to Carey's objection. Okay, now, what he gave as a response just doesn't work. And it looks like he immediately realized this is a bit awkward because he says it must indeed be recognized that here we are confronted by an awkwardness of language. No, we're not. Your response is awkward because it's subterfuge. And then he says, but this can't be avoided. If we say that the concept horse is not a concept, whereas, e.g., the city of Berlin is a city and the volcano Vesuvius is a volcano, yep, those would seem to be right. The city of Berlin is a city, the volcano Vesuvius is a volcano, the concept horse is a concept. Language, he says, is here in a predicament that justifies this nonsense. The peculiarity of our case is indicated by Carey himself by means of the quotation marks around horse. I use italics to the same end. There is no reason to mark out the words Berlin and Vesuvius in a similar way. In logical discussions, one quite often needs to say something about a concept and to express this in the form usual for such predications, namely to make what is said about the concept into the content of the grammatical predicate. Consequently, one would expect that the Bedeutung, the sense of the grammatical subject, would be the concept, but the concept as such cannot play this part in view of its predicative nature. It must first be converted into an object, or more precisely, an object must go proxy for it. Okay, now, the first part of this quote, I think, tells us nothing useful or interesting. But here, Frege is on to something, because what he's on to is that when you say the concept horse is not a concept, you resort to certain sorts of font choices or quotation devices to signal that you're not using the word horse, but you're rather doing something else with the word horse. Now, instead of saying the concept horse, you could have said the concept of being a horse. And there you don't need any special linguistic conventions for writing it that way. Just like when you wrote the city of Berlin or the volcano Vesuvius, you didn't need any single quotes or italics or any such thing. So if you had done it this way, without any special linguistic devices, you would have avoided what Frege said you couldn't avoid. So he says there's a peculiarity here that Carey himself recognizes because he puts quotations around horse. I use italics to the same end. We didn't need to do that in the case of Berlin and Vesuvius. I say, this is what I'm saying, not what's in the quote. You didn't need to do that in the case of the concept horse either. You can, but you don't need to. He then tries to draw some implications of this. In logical discussions, you quite often need to say something about a concept. That's awkward. Are you saying something about a concept? Yes, you are. In order to say something about a concept, you have to make that what is said about the concept into a grammatical predicate. Consequently, one would expect that the sense of the subject would be the concept. That's what you'd expect. But the concept can't play its part because to do that, it would have to be in the predicate. It would have to be expressed by the predicate, not by the subject of a sentence. If it's going to go into the subject position, it first has to be converted into an object. All right, now that last part, Frege is doing nothing more than insisting that subjects, if they refer, have to refer to objects. But that's, of course, the very point of the Carey objection. Why can't you refer to concepts? Well, the answer is because then reference would apply not to objects. The referent of a phrase might not be just an object, but might also be a concept. And that flies in the face of the exclusivity of this category scheme. And Carey would say, yeah, that was my point. There's obviously a difference between objects and concepts, but they don't have to be logically exclusive of each other in order for there to be such a difference. Okay, that's the first objection. I think Frege does not have a good response to it, although there's an important problem here to be sorted out. It's just that the devices in his semantic theory don't adequately do it. How to do it is an extremely hard problem, however. The second Here's another interesting problem, the problem about indexicality that I referred to earlier. So when I was talking about how indirect quotations work, I said, here's the words that came out of Joe's mouth. I am tired. Here's how I report what Joe said indirectly. I tell you, Joe said that he's tired. For the device of sense to do the work that Frege requires of it here, the sense of the sentence, I am tired, coming out of Joe's mouth, needs to be the same sense as the sense of the phrase, he's tired, coming out of my mouth. The Gustav Lauben problem from the thought threatens this account. It's an account of indexical sentences. Indexicals are words like I, here, and now. So what we've got is one such indexical. Consider the following case. Dr. Gustav Lauben says, I have been wounded. So he's expressed an indexical thought. Leo Peter, somebody who's not this doctor, hears this and remarks some days later, Dr. Gustav Lauben has been wounded. So this is another sentence. Now, before we read further, think about the relation between the sentence uttered by Lauben and the sentence uttered by Peter. Do they have the same sense or do they not have the same sense? You should be disposed to say that they have the same sense. That would make things the simplest that they could be, if in fact they have the same sense. Okay, so let's just go with that. Does this sentence express the same thought as the one Dr. Lauben uttered himself? Suppose that Rudolf Lingens were present when Dr. Lauben spoke, and now here's what is related by Leo Peter. If the same thought is uttered by Dr. Lauben and Leo Peter, then Rudolf Lingens, who is fully master of the language and remembers what Dr. Lauben has said in his presence, must now know at once. Don't to attach too much significance to the immediacy here. But Rudolf Lingens must now know from Leo Peter's report that the same thing is under discussion. It has to be pretty obvious to Lingens that they said the same thing. But knowledge of the language is a separate thing when it is a matter of proper names. It may well be the case that only a few people associate a particular thought with the sentence, Dr. Lauben has been wounded. Okay, so what's he thinking about? Well, look, does Lingens, who has mastered the language, know that the name of the person who he heard say, I have been wounded, is in fact Dr. Lauben? Maybe he knows that, maybe he doesn't. In this case, one needs for complete understanding a knowledge of the expression Dr. Lauben. Now, if both Leo Peter and Rudolf Lingens understand by Dr. Lauben, the doctor who lives is the only doctor in the house known to both of them, then they both understand the sentence, Dr. Gustav Glauben has been wounded, in the same way. They associate the same thought with it. But it's also possible that Rudolf Lingens doesn't know Dr. Glauben personally and doesn't know that he is the very Dr. Glauben who recently said, I have been wounded. In this case, Rudolf Lingens cannot know the same thing is in question. I say, therefore, in this case, the thought which Leo Peter expresses is not the same as that which Dr. Glauben uttered. Now, everyone is presented to himself. So this is a more general characterization of the particular kind of example we're talking about. Everyone is presented to himself in a particular and primitive way in which he is presented to no one else. Notice this language. This should make you think modes of presentation. How are you presented to yourself? In a way that you are presented to no one else. Well, to the extent that modes of presentation are included in senses, the sense for any sentence about yourself will involve a mode of presentation which can't be present in the sense of any sentence about you that is grasped by someone else. In essence, Frege is insisting that we're going to have private propositions in order to account for indexicality. So when Dr. Glauben thinks that he has been wounded, he will probably take as a basis this primitive way in which he is presented to himself. And only Dr. Glauben himself can grasp thoughts determined in this way. But now he may want to communicate with others. He can't communicate a thought which he alone can grasp. Therefore, if he now says, I have been wounded, he must use the I in a sense which can be grasped by others, perhaps in the sense of he who is speaking to you at this moment, by doing which he makes the associated conditions of his utterance serve for the expression of his thought. So, two things going on in this paragraph. The first part says, yeah, there are going to be private propositions, but communication can't depend on them. So take a look at the second part of this, where we're told what the other meaning of the word I is that's not a private meaning. The word I here has to mean he who is speaking to you at this moment has been wounded. There's a really simple argument why that can't be the meaning of the word I. Maybe something along these lines will work, but in general, you shouldn't be positing ambiguity except we're absolutely forced to. So the question is, are we forced to here? And we are if we want to adopt Frege's semantic theory, but maybe we're not forced to it. In any case, let's suppose we're trying to do the ambiguity thesis and distinguish the private sense of the word I from this other sense. And now Glauben says, I have been wounded. The claim is, oh, here's what he means. He is speaking to you at this moment. There's a very simple reason for thinking there is no such meaning of the word I. IMW. Whatever the sense, whatever the thought expressed by that sentence is, it does not entail your existence. It just doesn't. So if you say, here's a sentence P, here's a sentence Q, and they have the same meaning. One way to test to see whether they have the same meaning is to check their entailments. So since I am wounded does not entail your existence, but he who is speaking to you at this moment is wounded does entail your existence, it's very clear that I am wounded doesn't mean the same thing as the sentence where you replace I with this description. My suggestion then is, if you want to pursue this line of defense of Frege, find something that is the sense of the word I, but doesn't have untoward implications, untoward entailments, where things get entailed that weren't entailed by the use of the word I in the first sentence. Now this problem for the word I also goes for other indexicals. Indexicals like here, now, there, then, etc., as well as for other terms that are less explicitly indexical. Think of terms like autumn, winter, spring, and summer. Those are less explicitly indexical because those seasons depend on hemispheric location. There are other covertly indexical items. Think of trying to eternalize sentences by adding a date code, right? So think of, I am tired now. Well, that's clearly an indexical sentence. Let's replace it with, I am tired on January, I don't even know what today is. Let's say it's January 27th, 2021. Did I get rid of the indexicality? No, you got to know something about the calendar that I'm using. And so you have to advert to, what is it, the Gregorian calendar? Think of geocentric assumptions involved in directions, north, south, east, and west. The question here is, how extensive can the land of private or perspectively limited propositions be and not be objectionable? I understand the force of the idea that maybe sometimes there are perspectival propositions, but, for example, think of the possibility of omniscience. What does omniscience require? Knowing all truths. Well, if there are perspectival propositions, it's impossible to know all truths. I've actually written some articles on this from the 1980s, but if you're interested, check with me and I can give you the references where I talk about this. But in general, I think the idea of private propositions is something that you land yourself in and you wish you hadn't. It's a demerit against your semantic theory because privacy in propositions gets hard to reconcile with the communicability of our thoughts. So maybe we don't want such privacy to be present. A further concern, how many senses do there have to be? This turns out to be a rather interesting and puzzling predicament for Frege, although there's not a knockdown argument here to be raised against him. Suppose I say Aristotle believed that Socrates drank hemlock at dusk. I attribute a belief to Aristotle. It contains a mode of presentation of Socrates. It looks like that mode of presentation for Aristotle has to be the same as my mode of presentation for Socrates. Let me say that again. I think I used the wrong word. It looks like Aristotle's mode of presentation for Socrates has to be the same as mine. Is that plausible? Or should we start wanting to talk about modes of presentation that are close enough to each other? Here's another one. I don't know if y'all know who Fritz Warfield is. He's a philosopher at Notre Dame. His name is also Ted Warfield. Fritz is his nickname. Suppose I tell you Rose doesn't know that Ted Warfield is Fritz Warfield. Here it turns out we have 4 modes of presentation, 2 for Rose, 2 for me. The ones for Ted have to be close enough because Rose does know that Ted Warfield is Ted Warfield. And the ones for Fritz have to be close enough. How close are my own modes of presentation for Ted and Fritz? If they are the same, then I won't be able to correctly report Rose's lack of knowledge. And they won't match up with Rose's modes of presentation since hers is obviously quite different. So it looks like things have to be a bit fuzzy. And it reminds me of when I was a music major, if intonation was suffering a bit, our band director would say maybe it's close enough for jazz. Frege's response to this problem. This is more on Dr. Glauben, Dr. Gustav Lauben. Suppose Herbert Garner knows that Dr. Lauben was born on September 13th, 1875, at a certain place, and that this is not true of anyone else. Against this, suppose that he doesn't know where Dr. Laubin now lives, nor indeed anything about him. On the other hand, suppose Leo Peter does not know where Laubin was born. Then, as far as the proper name, Gustav Laubin, is concerned, Herbert Garner and Leo Peter do not speak the same language, since although they do in fact refer to the same man with this name, they don't know that they do so. Therefore, Herbert Garner does not associate the same thought with the sentence, Dr. Laubin has been wounded, as Leo Peter wants to express with it. To avoid the drawbacks of Herbert Garner's and Leo Peter's not speaking the same language, I am assuming that Leo Peter uses the proper name Dr. Laubin, and Herbert Garner, on the other hand, uses the proper name Gustav Laubin. Now, it is possible that Herbert Garner takes the sense of the sentence, Dr. Laubin has been wounded, to be true, while, misled by false information, takes the sense of the sentence, Gustav Laubin has been wounded, to be false. Under the assumption given, these thoughts are therefore different. Accordingly, with a proper name, it depends on how whoever it refers to is presented. This can happen in different ways, and every such way corresponds with a particular sense of a sentence containing a proper name. The different thoughts which thus result from the same sentence correspond in their truth values, of course. That is to say, if one is true, then all are true, and if one is false, then all are false. Nevertheless, their distinctness must be recognized. So it must really be demanded that a single way in which whatever is referred to is presented be associated with every proper name. It is often unimportant that this demand should be fulfilled, but not always. Now, this is a bit of subterfuge, I'm afraid. The problem is real. The solution is crazy. So the problem is modes of presentation, it looks like, are going to be connected with bodies of knowledge about the objects in question. And Frege's response to the kinds of, say, Fritz Warfield, Ted Warfield, Aristotle, Socrates example is that when your bodies of knowledge differ, the modes of presentation and hence the senses differ. What's the solution to that? The solution is, in order to be speaking the same language, the senses have to remain constant. And so, in order to be speaking the same language, the bodies of knowledge would have to be identical. By the end of this paragraph, we get this bizarre dismissal of a really important problem. It often doesn't matter that we're not speaking the same language, but sometimes it does matter. All right, if that's true, then the project in semantics is something that we need to rethink entirely. Why is that the case? Well, we've been thinking that communication requires underlying sameness of semantic content. If we give up that assumption, then it's not quite clear what we're doing when we want a theory of communication. But in any case, the semantics will be only ancillary to the theory of communication. So either we need sameness of semantic content so that when I say today is Wednesday, the sentence today and Wednesday has the same sense for you as for me, and that is part of the story as to how you and I are communicating properly rather than misunderstanding each other. If that's the case, if sameness of semantic content is a prerequisite for good communication, you can't do what Frege did here. It just doesn't work. The last notes here are about a Hume Heinsohn example that I've used in other classes, which hasn't come up in this one, so I'm going to skip that. What remains to be done is look at more of Frege's logic and the way in which Russell's set theoretic paradox threatens Frege's logicism and the connection between that and Cantor's theorem. But we'll talk about that in the next lecture.